Imagine a room so large it could house a commercial airplane, but instead of cargo, it is filled from floor to ceiling with nothing but stacks of white paper. There are 6 million individual pages in total. If you were to sit down and try to read every single one of them, spending just 60 seconds on each page, it would take you more than 11 years of constant reading without a single hour of sleep. This is the staggering scale of the Epstein archive. It is a massive, cold mountain of evidence that the public has only recently begun to understand in its full context. It is a story that goes far beyond the headlines. In a world where the news moves at the speed of a social media notification, we often lose sight of the sheer density of information contained within these records. We tend to focus on the loudest parts of the story, like the famous Black Book or the flight logs of the private jet known as the Lolita Express. But while the world was waiting for a single, simple list of names to drop, a much more complex and devastating story was being told through thousands of dry technical court filings and internal financial records. This is not just a sensationalist story about a wealthy man who lived a double life. It is the story of the unseen paper trail that allowed that life to persist for decades despite numerous warnings. This archive is composed of documents pulled from the deepest corners of the legal system. We are talking about thousands of pages from civil lawsuits, the massive 2024 unsealings, and internal documents from global banking giants. For a long time, these files were kept behind heavy locks, protected by court orders and anonymous labels like John Doe. It took the relentless persistence of investigative journalists and the incredible courage of survivors to finally bring these pages into the public eye. These journalists had to spend years parsing through millions of lines of dense legalese, cross-referencing dates, locations, and bank account numbers to slowly build a map of a shadow empire. When we dive into these records, the perspective shifts. It stops being about the perpetrator and starts being about the victims who were systematically silenced. The documents serve as a grim tool for reconstructing the truth from the long-standing cover-up. Consider the experiences of Virginia Giuffre. For a very long time, high-priced legal teams attempted to paint her testimony as unreliable or motivated by money. However, the 6 million documents tell a very different and much more consistent story. They provide the physical, undeniable proof of her movement across the globe at the hands of her abusers. The paperwork shows the wire transfers that funded the operation. It shows the flight manifests that place her in specific cities at specific times, exactly as she described. The archive confirms a horrific pattern of grooming and systemic abuse that was dismissed by the authorities for more than 25 years. We can see the mechanics of how a human being was treated like a commodity. There were invoices for international travel, detailed schedules for household staff, and records showing how young women were recruited under the false pretense of professional opportunities. The archive proves that this was not a series of isolated events, but a highly organized and extremely well-funded criminal operation. The foundation of this silence can be traced back to a specific legal document signed in 2008. This was the Florida Non-Prosecution Agreement, a deal that many legal experts now call patient zero of this entire scandal. On the surface, it appeared to be a standard resolution to local charges. However, as the documents have since revealed, the deal contained secret clauses that were almost completely unprecedented in the history of the United States justice system. These clauses did not just protect the man at the center of the investigation. They extended a blanket of legal immunity to any unnamed co-conspirators, even those who were never officially part of the case. This effectively meant that an entire circle of people was given a secret pass to avoid accountability for their roles in the operation. This was the moment when the justice system effectively split in two. One tier was for the general public, and the other was a private, protected lane for those with enough wealth and social standing to negotiate their way out of the reach of the law. There is a profound psychological weight that comes with examining these files. When you look through the same folders, you might see a formal letter from a head of state or a world-renowned scientist sitting directly next to a victim's testimony describing a night of unimaginable horror. It is a jarring juxtaposition that reveals how deeply this operation was woven into the fabric of the global elite. These documents show that these relationships were not just casual or distant. They were part of a social and financial ecosystem that prioritized the protection of the powerful over the safety of the most vulnerable members of society. It is a sobering reflection of a massive global failure of our institutions. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The gravity of this data tells us that this was never just about a single individual's crimes. It was about a collective failure to protect. The files show us that the red flags were visible for years. They were buried in the suspicious activity reports of major banking institutions like JP Morgan and Deutsche Bank. They were present in the complaints filed with local police departments that were mysteriously stalled or closed. They were spoken about in the hushed corridors of elite universities like Harvard and MIT, which continue to accept massive donations despite the growing rumors. The 6 million documents are the final, definitive proof that the truth was never truly hidden from those in power. It was simply ignored because the price of the silence was too high to turn down. Now that the seal has been broken by Judge Loretta Preska in the courts, there is no going back to the way things were. The records are now public, and they demand that we confront the mechanics of how wealth was used to purchase immunity on a global scale. This is only the beginning of what the paper trail reveals about the structures that govern our world. As the layers of this archive continue to peel away, we begin to see that the true power of this operation did not just lie in secrets, but in the sophisticated use of global financial systems to create a mirage of legitimacy. One of the most revealing aspects of the 6 million documents is the paper trail left by the Southern Trust Company. Based in the United States Virgin Islands, this entity was far more than just a business. It was a primary tool used to mask the movement of hundreds of millions of dollars. The files show how tax benefits and corporate loopholes were exploited to keep the source and destination of funds obscured from prying eyes. This was not a small-time scheme. It was a high-level financial shell game that required the cooperation, or at least the quiet compliance, of some of the most powerful banking institutions in the world. The litigation records from 2023 and 2024 have cast a harsh light on the roles of JP Morgan and Deutsche Bank. These records suggest that even when internal compliance officers raised red flags about suspicious cash withdrawals and transactions that fit the pattern of human trafficking, the banks continued their relationship for years. The documents reveal that the profit generated from such high net worth clients often outweighed the ethical concerns raised by the bank's own security teams. This financial infrastructure provided the oxygen that the entire operation needed to breathe. Without the ability to move vast sums of money across borders without question, the logistics of the abuse could never have reached such a global scale. The files contain internal emails where bank executives discussed the reputational risks, yet the accounts remained open, proving that for those with enough wealth, the standard rules of banking simply do not apply. But money alone was not enough to maintain this level of access to the world's elite. To move through the highest circles of society, one needs more than just a large bank account. One needs intellectual legitimacy. This is where the science shield comes into play. The documents reveal a calculated strategy of making massive donations to elite universities, specifically Harvard and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. By funding cutting-edge research and associating with some of the most brilliant minds on the planet, a veneer of respectability was created that served as a powerful distraction from a criminal record. The archive shows that these were not just passive gifts. They were often accompanied by requests for meetings with high-profile professors and invitations to participate in exclusive academic forums. The files detail what were known as the Edge Dinners. These were high-concept social gatherings where the world's leading scientists, philosophers, and tech moguls would gather to discuss the future of humanity. The documents show that these dinners were not just about intellectual exchange. They were a sophisticated recruitment tool. By positioning himself as a patron of the sciences, the financier was able to weave himself into the social fabric of the global intellectual elite. When the rumors of his behavior began to circulate, many in these circles were quick to dismiss them, pointing to his perceived intelligence and his support for human progress as proof of his character. The paperwork proves that this was a deliberate and successful attempt to buy a form of social immunity that is often more valuable than legal protection. Moving from the boardrooms and ivory towers to the physical world, the archive provides an incredibly detailed look at the logistics of this empire. For years, the internet has been filled with myths and legends about the private jet known as the Lolita Express. However, the 6 million documents allow us to separate fact from fiction by examining the actual flight logs and tail numbers. These logs are more than just a list of names. They are a map of a mobile office for power brokering. We can see the frequent trips between New York, Florida, the private island in the Caribbean, and various European capitals. The passenger manifests place high-profile figures, including Prince Andrew and other members of the global elite, on these flights during times that often coincide with the testimonies of survivors. The maintenance records and staff testimonies found in the files reveal that this was not a solo effort. It required an entire army of assistants, pilots, housekeepers, and security personnel to keep the operation running smoothly. These employees were often bound by strict non-disclosure agreements, which are also documented in the archive. The paperwork shows how an environment of total surveillance and control was maintained, not just for the victims, but for the staff as well. This was a world where every detail was managed, from the specific brands of food in the pantry to the precise timing of travel arrangements, to ensure that the private life of the financier remained entirely separate from his public persona. The records show the salaries and bonuses paid to those who remained silent, creating a culture of complicity that lasted for decades. This web was not confined to the United States. The documents highlight an extensive international network, with significant links to France and the United Kingdom. Ghislaine Maxwell is frequently identified in these records as the architect of the social bridge. She was the one who possessed the social capital and the connections to navigate the complex hierarchies of European high society. The files suggest that her role was essential in vetting and recruiting the individuals who would eventually become part of the financier's inner circle. The documents from the French investigation provide a window into how the operation expanded its reach, utilizing luxury properties in Paris to host the same kind of gatherings seen in the United States. This international dimension made the operation even harder to dismantle, as it could shift its focus from one jurisdiction to another to avoid scrutiny. Perhaps the most controversial and discussed aspect of the archive involves the potential for intelligence agency involvement. While the documents do not provide a smoking gun that confirms a specific state actor was directing the operation, they do contain suggestive evidence that is difficult to ignore. The architecture of the properties, as described in maintenance and renovation records, suggests a high level of sophisticated surveillance equipment was installed in guest rooms. This has led many to believe that the goal was the collection of compromising material to be used as leverage against powerful guests. While the files are careful with their wording, the pattern of behavior and the level of protection enjoyed by the operation for decades continue to fuel theories about a deeper connection to the world of international espionage. The mechanics of power and secrecy revealed in these 6 million documents show a system that was designed to be impenetrable. It was a combination of financial complexity, social engineering, and physical logistics that allowed a criminal enterprise to hide in plain sight for a quarter of a century. As we move closer to understanding the full scope of this archive, we see that the names on a list are only a small part of a much larger picture of how our world truly operates when wealth and influence are allowed to bypass the rules. The paper trail is a map of a world where the boundaries between business, science, and crime were intentionally blurred to protect those at the very top. This part of the archive forces us to ask how many other systems of power are currently operating with the same level of immunity, waiting to be eventually unveiled. The unsealing of the final documents in early 2024 was not merely a data dump. It was the final wave of a decade-long tsunami that fundamentally altered the public understanding of power and accountability. Under the methodical direction of Judge Loretta Preska, the federal court in New York began the painstaking process of identifying individuals who had spent years hidden behind the pseudonym John Doe. This system of legal anonymity had served as a final fortress for the wealthy and the influential, allowing their names to remain redacted in court filings, even as the evidence around them continued to mount. However, as thousands upon thousands of pages were finally released to the public, it became clear that the true value of these records was not just the shock of seeing a famous name. Instead, it was the granular, devastating detail of the interactions themselves. The archive revealed that many of these individuals were not just accidental acquaintances in a vast social network. They were active participants in a carefully constructed ecosystem designed to normalize the unthinkable. The legal battle over the disclosure of these names played out in real time, showcasing a desperate and expensive struggle for anonymity. For years, the public had engaged in intense speculation about who might be on the list, but the reality presented by the archive was far more complex than any internet rumor. It showed how legal maneuvers and elite representation were used to delay the inevitable for as long as possible. When the unsealing finally occurred, it shattered the seal of silence that had protected the inner circle of Jeffrey Epstein since his initial arrest in Florida, and his subsequent death in federal custody. The documents provided the missing context for why certain names appeared in flight logs or at the infamous Edge dinners. This shifted the global conversation from vague suspicion to documented association, proving that the proximity to power was often used as a shield against scrutiny. This leads us to the staggering accountability gap that remains even after 6 million pages have been scrutinized by journalists and legal experts. While the documents have served to confirm the horrific testimonies of survivors like Virginia Giuffre, justice has been tragically uneven in its distribution. We are left looking at a world where a few have faced the full weight of the law, while many others remain seemingly untouchable in their positions of high authority. However, the archive has effectively destroyed the defense of plausible deniability. In the past, high-profile figures could claim they were simply unaware of the illicit activities occurring in the background of their social lives. But the paper trail reveals a different story altogether. It shows that many individuals were alerted to the financier's predatory behavior years, if not decades, before his final downfall. Through internal emails, legal memos, and personal correspondence, the documents prove that the warning signs were not just ignored. They were often intentionally suppressed to protect the social and financial benefits that came with being part of that elite circle. The institutional fallout from these revelations has been profound, reaching deep into the worlds of global finance and elite higher education. Major banking institutions, most notably JP Morgan Chase and Deutsche Bank, found themselves under intense legal fire. The documents from the 2023 and 2024 litigation showed that these banks were not merely passive facilitators of financial transactions. Instead, they had internal reports flagging suspicious activity that were repeatedly pushed aside by senior executives who valued the prestige and the massive profit associated with the accounts. JP Morgan eventually agreed to a settlement of $290 million, while Deutsche Bank settled for $75 million. This reckoning extended to the ivory towers of Harvard University and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The files revealed how deeply the financier's influence had penetrated these historic institutions, leading to the resignations of high-profile chief executive officers and university officials. These were individuals who had built their entire careers on reputations of integrity, only to have the document trail expose their direct and repeated links to a criminal enterprise. As we reflect on the legacy of these 6 million documents, the most striking lesson is the undeniable existence of a two-tier justice system. The archive acts as a physical manifestation of how extreme wealth can be used to purchase a different version of reality. For more than 25 years, the financier and his associates used the legal system as a protective barrier rather than being subject to its rules. The importance of transparency in this process cannot be overstated, and the role of the Freedom of Information Act has been absolutely crucial in bringing these truths into the light. Without the persistent efforts of investigative journalists and the immense courage of survivors who pushed for the unsealing of these records, this entire empire of secrecy might have remained hidden forever. The files serve as a permanent reminder that transparency is the only effective antidote to the kind of systemic corruption that allowed this operation to flourish in plain sight. However, there is a modern danger that the archive brings to the surface, and that is the concept of conspiracy fatigue. In an era of instant information and endless digital speculation, the sheer volume of data can become overwhelming. This often leads the public to tune out, or worse, fall into the trap of unverified rumors and sensationalist theories. We must resist the urge to focus on the myths, and instead ground our understanding in the proven facts contained within these files. The documents are a mirror reflecting the darkest corners of modern power structures. They show us that the problem was never just about one individual. It was about a vast network of enablers who prioritized their own status and financial gain over the lives and safety of the vulnerable. In the end, the final verdict provided by these 6 million documents is a call to action for the future. We cannot allow the story to end simply because a court file has been closed. The role of the spectator and the citizen is to demand systemic change so that wealth and influence can no longer purchase a lifetime of immunity from the law. We must insist on a global system where accountability is not a commodity that can be bought, sold, or traded among the elite. These documents provide a map of exactly where the system failed, and they give us the tools to ensure those failures are never repeated. The legacy of this archive should not be one of despair or cynicism, but one of a renewed commitment to a world where the voices of survivors are finally louder than the silence of the powerful. By looking directly into this mirror, we see the work that remains to be done to build a society that is truly transparent, and where the rules of justice apply equally to everyone, regardless of the size of their bank account or the depth of their social connections.